Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about testing and threshold data in this presentation. There's a lot of information I want to go through. There's a lot of details to talk about of how to do the testing for all three disciplines, swim, bike, and run. We're going to go through some specific tests relative to each of those. We're going to talk about some specific ways to apply that to your training. And then we're going to talk about some ways to strategize, if you will, of how to do the testing. Before you get going, there's a couple things I want to throw out in terms of words of caution. Whenever we do testing, if you remember back to when you were in school, whatever level that was, if the teacher walked in and says, pop quiz, your heart started fluttering, you just got a little nervous, and you just kind of got anxious about that performance because you cared about it. So when you start hearing about testing and you get anxious about the test coming up, know that that's normal. That anxiety, that stress that you're going to get going into a test, the anxiousness that you have, however you want to define that, that's normal. One of the things that with that anxiety, with that nervousness, with that anticipation, it can either be a good thing, get you ready to fight, get you ready to do the performance, to have a great showing and so forth, or it can actually do the opposite. It can pull away from your performance. So whoever you are, however you approach those, it's important that you know that information so that you can find ways to strategize to handle that anxiety, that nervousness, or ways to use that. And as we're going through the testing, if that's you and you're having trouble because it's taking away from your performance, and let's talk about that in terms of your testing. The other thing is, don't get caught up into this testing defining you as an athlete. You may do some testing and on one day, your performance isn't great. You're not terrible. You're not anything less than. Don't let the testing take away from who you are as an athlete. Also, the next thing on this is that if you and someone else are doing a test and you know that you're doing that test and you start comparing data, that's really never a good thing. There's so many other variables that go into that in terms of pure speed or just be cautious on when you're comparing that data. I see a lot of athletes who do a test and they had a PR, they had some great performance, and they'll be excited about it until they talk to somebody else who had a second faster or a minute faster, or you had something that was just a little better, and then they lose the joy. They lose that positiveness that they just had from that great performance. So don't let that data define who you are, and be careful about comparisons. Okay, so why do I ask you guys many times to do testing or to do this kind of stuff? Other than it's fun for me to watch you get anxious and nervous and work really hard. Number one, it helps us set our threshold data, our training zones. We're going to try to find performances and then use that data to extrapolate into the different energy systems that we want to train. So it's important that we have you in the appropriate training zones, whether we're looking at your wattage, your speed, your heart rate, your rate of perceived exertion. We'd be able to use those to extrapolate into training zones is important. We use testing to show progress, right? So you go do some training and then, is it helping? Is it benefiting? Are you improving? Well, we need a test. It's just like if you go back to think about your studies, the teacher, the instructor gave you a lot of knowledge, you studied it, and then they give you a test to see if you absorbed it, see if things were improving, see how well you did. Think of it in the same ways to check progress, to identify markers, if you will, of where you're at. The third thing that I use testing for is to look for areas to improve. So if we're either looking at perceived exertion, we're looking at heart rate, we're looking at pace, we're looking at wattage, we're looking at all kinds of things in there. And as if something isn't improving or is a low-hanging fruit, it kind of shows us where we need to target your training in the next block or so, if you will. So now we've got all that out of the way. Let's talk about some specific tests. And we'll start with the swim side. There's a bunch of tests that we could do. There are two that I really like. And that's the 200 and the 400 tests. And that's the 3x300 tests. Okay. Here's what we're looking for on the 2x4. I'm looking, I record data for you when you do the testing. I'm looking at your stroke rate. I'm looking at your cadence. I'm looking at if you have it, what your heart rate is, although I really don't care about it as much in the swim, the heart rate, but I do look at that. I'm looking at what your pace is and your overall time, okay? If your 200 pace and your 400 pace are identical, I'm wondering why that is, right? And so if your 200 pace is an all out and it's a 2 minute, and your 400 pace all out is 2 minute pace, we've got an issue going on that you really don't have a different gear that you can get into. So there's some things that we would want to talk about or look at there in terms of your speed or maybe your performance or something in that kind of, should be a difference. Similar when we start talking about the run, if you do an 800 and a 1600, the paces should be different when you're running a half-mile time trial and a mile time trial. If they're not different in that 200, 400, there's something going on. You've gotten into a groove, you've gotten comfortable, or there's something there that we need to try to get you out of that comfort zone. The 3x300, we're really, what I'm looking for there is, can you hold a certain pace for a period of time, and look at how much time, how much rest interval you choose to take in there. I'll give you some prescription on that, but again, I'm looking at the cadence, I'm looking at the pace, and if you got heart rate, I'm looking at it. And how consistent can you hold those 300s, or do you start fading off? And it's a measure really of looking at your endurance, your perseverance, if you will. How long can you hold those pieces? Okay, so those are things that as you see those two specific tests and you're going into them, or you see those going on, I would really like you to focus on what we just talked about there. Other tests that you may see is a kick versus pull dominance test. Well, this is similar to the 3x300, except it's a 4x300, where your first and third 300 are regular. You're just going to freestyle swim. Your second and fourth 300, we'll put a pool buoy between your legs, and we're going to compare times. Your first and third, when you're regularly freestyle swimming, should be fastest. Those two should be the fastest because you're using your legs, you're using your arms, you're floating through the water, you've got good efficiency, should be fastest. Take your legs away, put a pool buoy in, just using your arms, you're just pulling. If that becomes your faster, then we got to talk about your balance. We got to talk about what's going on there, because your balance in the water when you're using your legs is probably off. That's what's slowing you down, you're adding drag. If your pool is faster, if your pull is faster than your freestyle, we got to talk about your leg drops, and we got to talk about your kick and improving that. If your pull is a little slower, we got to talk about mechanics. We got to talk about what's happening with that catch, with that pull. How does that really work? Because you now take your legs away and you've gotten slower, and there's a threshold of how slow it is. Obviously, you should slow down just a little bit, but there's a drop off that we would see if you're not using your legs, if your kick is too strong relative to your pull. So that's a test that on some of you may see, and that's what I'm looking for. Another test for our long distance event individuals is I may look at a 3x800, and I'm trying to do the same thing as a 3x3. I'm just looking at it from a longer duration. If I get really silly with you, or I really want to push you a little bit, I may do a 3x1000, but that would be late in your training when I'm really trying to do fitness and testing and kind of give you some perspective of things late stage race training or late stage prior to an event. So those are the tests of what I'm looking for relative to the swim. I'm looking for, is there a difference in speed if I double your duration? So at 200, 400, I'm looking at consistency, and I'm measuring your pace as well as your cadence. And sometimes I'm looking at your heart rate. So as you're looking at your data, you can go in and kind of look at those and just see what you see. And if you've got any questions, let's talk about it specific to you. Moving on to the bike. This is where there's a lot of things to look at. There's a lot of different ways of testing your power on the bike, or your heart rate on the bike, or your speed on the bike. And depending on what equipment you have, we may target one or the other. I like using power. That objective number, those number of watts, makes it really easy when you're riding, if you've got a computer, to know what you're going to put out in terms of power effort and work effort. And then in the training, if we've got that same number, we can be objective, we can be deliberate in how many watts can you sustain and still get off the bike and run. Okay, so let's figure out different ways of determining your FTP test. There's a ramp test out there. You can go on pretty much any any smart trainer, any sort of app, and there'll be a ramp test where you'll start at a certain wattage, and then every minute or two you add 10 watts or 10%, depending on what they're looking at. And you just go until you can't sustain it for that minute. And, we use that data to extrapolate what your predicted FTP test, what your FTP numbers would be off of that ramp test. And so you ramp up. There's another test where it's pretty much more typical. It's a 20-minute all-out test where you would ride as hard as you'd warm up. You'd ride as hard as you could, as consistently as you could, best sustainable effort for 20 minutes. You get your average FTP in that 20 minutes, and then you take that number and we'd use 95% of it. And that would be your predicted FTP to ride. We could look at your heart rate during that time. We could look at what cadence you chose to ride at. You might even, depending on what you did on the course, you could even look at speed if you wanted to use that. But those two ways are pretty traditional of how to find your FTP. One of the tests that I've been using more recently does the 20-minute test, but it's incorporated into a much larger test because I want to look at a bunch of different pieces. So this is the one that most of you would see. You'd have some sort of warm up, maybe a 10-15 minute warm up, depending on who you are and how you best warm up. You'd have a couple stages of ramping or increasing intensity. Each of those maybe a minute. You might have 3 or 4 of those where you'd ramp up with intensity, you'd recover. And then there's 2 5-second all-out bursts where you get on the pedals and you grind it and you try to show off how much power you have in those 2 5-second bursts. So I'm looking at what's your max output, what's your highest number that you can touch. Okay, is that 1,000? Is that 500? What is that number? You recover, and then it's a 5-minute best sustainable effort. So for 5 minutes, you would treat it as a time trial. You would ride as relatively hard as you could and sustain a consistent effort that entire time. So using RPE, using wattage, using heart rate, but it would be a time trial, 5 minutes, and you'd see what you would average over that 5-minute period. You'd have a short recovery, 3 to 5 minutes recovery, and then we would do the 20-minute time trial like we had just described there, where you go all out for 20 minutes and see what your average would be or your best sustainable effort. You'd recover off of it, almost done. And then you'd have a 1-minute time trial to see what you could sustain there. Okay, so we got 4 different data points. With the 5 seconds, we got your max effort. What's the highest wattage you could push out? We got your best sustainable effort for 5 minutes. We got your best sustainable effort for 20 minutes. We got your best sustainable effort for a minute. Okay, now here's what we'll do with that data. We'll look at cadence and we'll look at heart rate. You can have the perceived exertion. There's places for you to mark that in there. We'd look at the power, all those pieces. If your 5-second effort is way up here, it's called 1,000. Your 1-minute effort is down here, let's call it 750. Your 5-minute effort's down here, and we'll call that 600, 650. And then your 20 minutes down here, and it's 300. Okay, the great numbers, right? So I would expect to see something like that where there's some sort of nice little curve that goes on. The shorter the duration, the higher the wattage, the longer duration, the lower the wattage. If that curve is off, okay, let's say that your 5-second burst is only 500, your 1 minute is now 400, and your 5-minute is 350, and your 20 minutes is 325. Well, you got great endurance. You're able to hold that for a long period of time, but you don't have much power. You're not able to push that higher level of there. So we would want to work more on short interval pieces. We will work on building your power. Conversely, if your 5-second was at 1,000, but your 20-minute is only 150, well, we got to work on some endurance. We got to push some power for longer periods of time. You just can't hold those pieces. So that helps me figure out where we need to kind of push you into how long do we hold intervals, at what level do we hold intervals, and try to balance all those pieces out so that you have a good balance of all the energy systems that you're going to need for cycling. Okay, so that test has become one of my favorite tests because it gives me a lot of data and I can compare it. It's not just a number of your FTP, but how does it compare with everything else? Your 5-second, your 1 minute, your 5-minute, all those different pieces. Okay, now think about your riding, right? You're out there You know, you're on a flat course, you're going to sustain an FTP for a long period of times. But if you got little rolling hills or you got some things that you got to climb, right? You're going to have to spike some pieces. And how much power do you really have to get up? Or are you going to try to keep that same wattage? And you know, can you maintain speed going up and down? It gives us a lot of feedback of those pieces. A couple other ways to measure your FTP, and these are good too. You know, would be to have a 30-minute time trial. You know, what can you ride? Instead of the 20-minute, you know, use a 30-minute. What could you realistically ride for those 30 minutes? And you know, from there we can get closer. And the other thing, guys, is your actual training. You know, you go outside and you're going to have an hour and a half ride. What are your average watts? What is your normalized power? What can you truly put out? Not just on test day, but what can you realistically put out when you're truly riding? Doing things on a trainer for a test and putting out a lot of wattage, that's great. But what's going to happen on race day? Some of you, when you're outside, outperform what you do inside. Okay, and there's a lot of different pieces that happen here. Some of you, of how you ride outdoors is different than you ride on the trainer. So let's say that you, when you get outdoors, you're a little nervous, you're apprehensive, you don't put the same power into it because you don't feel as safe. Your bike handling skills out there. It doesn't matter what your FTP is because you're not going to apply it when you get outside either. So, you know, when we start looking at these numbers, there's a lot of things that go into based on you, your comfort level of riding outside, your comfort level of putting power in, of really going fast, right? Indoors, you might be riding at 23 mile an hour, but you get outside in that 23 mile an hour, you got a lot of wind and it feels scary, right? You're just not as comfortable with it. So we can have some great numbers, but how do you really apply it? How do you really ride? How we're going to use it on race day? Those are things that we've got to keep in mind and consider as we're getting this data. We've got to make sure we can apply it to you and does it really affect race day performance? Okay, let's move on to the run. Lots of testing here, lots of ways to do this. You know, the 5K time trial or 3.1 miles is pretty traditional. A lot of people you'll see online, they'll use that and say if you've got that average heart rate, that average pace, that you can predict all kinds of other events and paces and thresholds, and that's true. That's a great one to use. Other people that have used 10K time trials, they've used 30-minute time trials where you'll run as best sustainable effort, the best pace you can. You time trial 30 minutes. But you only collect the data for the last 20, whether it's heart rate or pace, and you're really just looking at that. So there's a lot of different things that can go into some of these. Let me get into things that I want to, that you are going to see more. I'll use those, but I want to dig deeper into things. So just like the 200, 400 for the swim, I go to a 1600 and an 800. I really like that test. We're going to look at a speed and a little bit more endurance. If you go out and run an 800, and let's say you run it in 3 minutes, okay, you're at a 6-minute pace. You go out and run a 1600 and you run it at an 8-minute pace. We got some issues. You've got the speed, but you can't hold it. Okay, so your rate of regression, your rate of being able to maintain speed, you don't have it. And so we need to work on that speed or that threshold or that intensity to be able to build up that endurance to hold that speed longer, right? Let's go the other way. Let's say that your 800 time is a 4-minute, but you go out and time trial and you're really running like an 805. Well, you don't have any speed. You've got one gear, just like what we talked about with that swimming. We've got to figure out how to get that leg turnover. We've got to figure out how to get that cadence, perhaps. We've got that stride length, whatever it is, we've got to figure out how to get you some speed. And so that gives us some idea of where your low-hanging fruit would be in terms of running faster. You could do that with any two distances, 2x of something, right? So 800, 16, you could do it with 1632, you could do it with 5K, 10K, 1 mile, 2 mile, you could do it with a bunch of different pieces. Which one we choose really comes down to what distances you're training for. If you're trying to do marathon training, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just compare 800 and 1600 because you got so much other volume going on. It might make more sense to look at a 5K, 10K for something like that. So again, wherever you're at, time of the year, distance you're training for, you'll see some sort of 2x time trial stuff going on. And that's what I'm looking for, trying to see what your speed is and then how long can you carry that speed. Getting into the science of it, there's rates of regression, 3 to 5% would be great numbers, that you don't lose more than that in that regression. And I'm talking right now for the 800, 1600. If we go from 5K to 10K, that might turn into 8%, depending on what's going on with that rate of regression. Another time trial that I really like is a 4x16 or 1 mile repeats, right? So go out there and you run a time trial for a mile and you take a little break, you do it again, take a little break, do it again. Now get your fourth one in. They should be pretty consistent within a few seconds. And a few seconds, 10, 15, you wouldn't really want to lose more than that. But if you do, then I know you don't have the endurance to maintain that speed or whatever that was. If they're all the same and you didn't lose any time, well, how much did you really push early on? Did you sandbag? Did you really do that testing? So I like where we're doing 4 of something, be able to push, check out the speed, check out the longevity, how well can you hold or maintain those pieces. Some other tests that some of you have seen, some of you may see coming up here is a 3x17 minute time trial. Now, 17 minutes, it sounds like a crazy number, but the first 2 minutes that you get going on that are really trash minutes, right? So you're getting warmed up, you're getting kind of it and getting the groove. I use 17 minutes because I'm really looking at the last 15. If you, for 15 minutes, if you can hold a certain pace and repeat that consistently and not have too much loss of power, you've got a great endurance system going on. You can potentially have some good speed depending on what's happening. And we would compare 800, 1600 mile time trial, 5K time trial, and then maybe the 3x17 if you're going really long distance, and look at all those and see if they're consistent or see where we've got some call it flaws in your training or in your fitness, and where we need to fill the gaps. Okay, I want to pause just for a second. There's a bunch of pieces there. All of these, we're trying to figure out what your speed is, what your power is, what your intensity that you can hold for short durations, and then how well can you hold that? How long can you hold that as we're looking at some of the endurance events, and all that would be applied to you. All that would be applied to the distances you're training for, as well as the time of year, what part of the training plan that you're in, of what's going on. So a lot of you that are doing some testing right now, and right now it just happens to be that we're in an off season or a post season, an early preseason, wherever you want to label yourself. No reason to go out and do 5K time trials where you're doing 1, 2, 3 of those back to back. I mean, that's late season stuff. So a lot of you will see some shorter distance efforts. Some of you have seen some 400 repeats. Some of you might see some 800 repeats. You might see the 800, 1600. As you go in and look at the data, I would really encourage you as you're looking at it, don't look at just the time, but how did you get that time? What was your cadence? Was your cadence consistent for an 800 and a 1600? Was it consistent for a 1 mile time trial and a 5K? Was your stride length the same? Maybe even look at the beginning of each of those and how much did it fall off? If your cadence early on was, make up numbers, if your cadence early on was in 185, and then toward the end of that effort, it's down to 170, you're not able to maintain that cadence. There's a lot of stuff we got to look at in terms of pulling in there. Same thing if your stride shortens and not even maintain your stride length, there's some things that we can look at inside there. But as you're looking at the data, those would be some great things for you to look at. And then, help me. I mean, as you look at that data, I may be glancing at it and not see what you see. I mean, you feel your body, what's going on inside there. Feel free to go, hey, I see this. What do you think? Or I see this and I think it's like this. Or I didn't think it was, it felt really hard, but look at my pace. It didn't fall off. Or I didn't think it was that hard. And look at my pace. It fell off. All those things are important for you to internalize and look and review, not just the final result, what the pace was or what your time was, but how did you get there? One of the things that we make a mistake on is we're trying to go faster. We would all love to go faster. No matter how fast we are, we'd love to go faster. I would challenge us, let's figure out how not to slow down, right? If we go out and do a 400, a quarter mile at X pace, at X intensity, at X cadence, and we get there, how can we do that same thing for longer without slowing down? Now, if you go out and do a time trial of 400, you're not going to run that same effort for a marathon, right? So there is some slowing down. But how do we minimize how much we slow down would be a great thing, right? So we'll look at some things that, with your data, that's the lens I'd like you to look through for whether you're swim, biking, and running, looking at those things relative to how did it feel? What was your rate of perceived exertion? How hard was it? If you're going to do a time trial and you get done, you're like, that was an 8 out of 10. That wasn't a hard time trial. That wasn't your best effort because it should have been a 10 out of 10. If you had whatever the RPE was and you got a certain heart rate, you can start to correlate. I work at this effort, my heart rate goes here. Pace, wattage, all those things. Okay. Some things that I want you to pay attention also is lactate threshold. What does that really mean? So I'm shifting gears here. We're just talking about some terms that you may come across that others may try to explain, or you may read about them and so forth. Lactate threshold is that magic spot where your body is able to balance how much lactate it's producing and how much that lactate affects you, right? So that threshold, that ability to be balanced there, that's what most of you are going to be able to go run your 5K, 10K, half marathon intensities at. Your heart rate threshold, your pace threshold, your RPE will all be at that lactate threshold. So whatever your numbers are, whatever you're able to maintain your average, you can assume that that's your lactate threshold. When I say assume, there's other pieces, and we can clarify it. But that's the thing that I would really like you, if you hear lactate threshold, that's your paces that you can maintain 5K or longer. Okay, your threshold stuff. If for some reason you wanted to know exactly what your numbers were and you wanted to figure out what your lactate threshold was, I can test that for you. We'll put you on a treadmill, we'll make you run, I'll prick your finger every 3 minutes, we'll measure your lactate, and then when your lactate reaches a certain level, we'll know what your threshold is and we can compare it. Okay, we can get you in the lab, we can do the testing, give those numbers. The field test many times gives you the same, if not better, information because they're real, how you're going to be training. So don't get caught up in when people start talking about, I've got to have some lactate testing, I need to look at your lactate numbers. It is important. It is great information, but sometimes when we get in the practical world versus the lab setting, sometimes those numbers don't mean as much. VO2 max is another number. How much oxygen can you inhale, can you bring in? What's the maximum volume of oxygen you can bring? You'll hear people talk about it. Higher the VO2, the better your aerobic capacity is a true statement. But I've seen some very fast individuals that, try not to use any specifics, but at one point I measured the VO2 max on a high school cross country team. Okay, now these are 16 to 18-year-olds who are very elite level runners. They very fast. We would measure their VO2. They were all 60 plus. Okay, so this is millimeters of oxygen per relative to their body weight in kilograms, so forth. So 60 plus, very high, very elite. Some of them were 70s. The 70 was probably the 15th runner on that team. Your best runner, the fastest runner, the one who won everything that he was in, was like a 61, 62. So VO2 doesn't always mean that they're going to be the fastest runner, that you're going to be the fastest runner. Now, all of them were 60 plus, very elite level, some great stuff. But there's some other factors that go into when you have these numbers that truly affect performance. How much discomfort can you endure, right? You go out and do a time trial. I want to run a 1 mile time trial, and it hurts to a certain level. If I maintain that intensity, how long can I truly hold it? What's my mental capacity to be able to push through some of that discomfort and be able to hold it? Or do I give in? And me, I give in quite a bit. I mean, I feel like I don't push as much when I get into some of that discomfort place. Some of you may be the same. Some of you might be, tough as nails, if so to speak. We're able to push through. So your fitness or your VO2 or your threshold might be different, but you can maintain or push through at a higher level than somebody with a higher number, right? So it doesn't always extrapolate into your VO2 is higher, so you're going to be faster. There's so many other factors that you got to take into account. Your experience. Are you a newbie? Are you a veteran? How long have you been willing to endure discomfort? What's your experience in terms of knowing what your body's going to respond, how it's going to respond, your recovery time? How much is that pain really just discomfort, or is your body lying to you and it's something more? How about if you, uh, some people just know they can push harder and they're willing to maintain that intensity, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into true performance relative to your tests. I guess that's what I'm trying to show. I've got just a couple more things. I'm going to talk about how to take some of these tests. We talked about that anxiety and that stuff that you get if somebody asks you about, hey, here comes a test. First thing is to relax. Each of you have different ways that you can calm yourself. Some people breathe, or they meditate, or they get different ways to get focused, to get their mind right. There's a bunch of different terms that we throw around to get ready for testing. Whatever that is, I'm just going to use the word relax, or just know what you're doing. Don't put so much pressure on yourself that you can't have a good performance. So, have a realistic expectation for the day. If you give your best sustainable effort for whatever you're doing, we're going to get some great data. If you go in and you go too hard too early and you fade, we're not going to get some great data. The test is not as useful as what it could be. Follow the theme of the test. So, read what the test is, read what the instructions are, know what we're attempting to do, use some of the things we've talked about already relative to the different tests to, here's the data we're trying to look at, and how do we get the best quality data out of that? Okay. So how do you prepare? Get some sleep. Get some sleep. Most of us, we don't sleep very well. And there's a bunch of recent data out there on sleep quality. You can Google it and look at what some of the elite level athletes are doing relative to sleep. And if you look at a lot of the pro sports, elite level stuff, sleep is the place that they're going right now to try to get the biggest gains or the edge of things. So quality sleep is important. Your nutrition. What's your fueling going into whatever you're doing? Time of day. When do you perform best? Toward the end of the day, a couple of you we've already talked about that you aren't early risers. You go to work, you go throughout your day, you have that stress going on, and then you're going to do a test at night, and it's not your best effort. You feel tired going into it. Now, that may be good data relative to your training, because you're going to train at that same time, but it might not be the best time for you to get your testing going on. Other preparation things here would be looking at who are you testing with? What environment are you testing in? Some of you, if you do it on your own, you're not as motivated. When it starts getting sore, it starts getting uncomfortable, it's easy to give in. Some of us, me included, really thrive or do better when we have somebody watching, or we know somebody's going to be there. We're in a race. So if you have a 5K time trial, find a 5K race and go be competitive. Do something to help you take the edge off of what you're feeling, right? So you're able to focus on, I'm not letting that person pass through. I'm not letting that person get so far in front of me. You have all those distractions to help keep you there. When we're looking at the testing, keep this in mind. Your pace, heart rate, RPE, watts if it's on a bike, and your cadence are what we're looking for. We're looking for, is that repeatable for your testing? Is that repeatable from one test to the next? Some of the tests that you're going to be given, we're going to do things over a 2 or 3 week period because I want to see some consistency in that testing. Is that data now repeatable on race day? If you were going to go do that, could you sustain those efforts, or are the numbers off, or if they're skewed? How do we make those numbers applicable to what you're going to be doing on race day? And the last thing I want to talk about on the testing is you may have a great day, you may have a not great day. Whenever the data comes back, if you are excited about it, figure out what happened to make you excited about that. Because if you're excited, you exceeded your expectations. What was your preparation to help you exceed those expectations? Maybe you got some sleep. Maybe it was your stress level. Maybe it was nutrition. Maybe a bunch of different options. But what was it? Use that. Same way if you have a performance that you're not as excited about. It just wasn't the same performance. Why was that? Look at those pieces behind the scenes of what might have contributed to good or bad performances. And as we get closer to race day, as we use it in our training, as we're using it in different things, let's see if we can repeat those and have the same effect on our performance. If you can find those pieces, I really think that's more important than the true testing stuff coming out. What helps you have a good day? What affects you in a negative way, right? So we really want to add or take away those pieces that we're looking at testing. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? That was awesome. I did a great job with presenting it to you and great information. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me on either through the website or through texting, whatever it is, depending on where you're hearing this at. Good luck on your testing. Good luck in your racing. Look forward to seeing you guys out there.